Thank you very much. As I drove up, I don't know if all of you saw that there was this huge crowd outside. And I figured either there was a fifth grader graduating and bringing all of his relatives, or it was a Jack Latvala for governor rally. I'm not sure which it is still. If you go on the internet and Google Jack Latvala and Don Gates in one Google, the first thing you find is a reference where Senator Latvala calls me a hypocrite. And the second reference, I call him a bully. And that's when we were friends. Senator Latvala inspires passion in people. And the reason he inspires passion is because he gets things done. Because he wades into issues, tackles important things that matter to the people of Florida, and gets things done. And whether you oppose him or support him on a particular issue, and Senator Latvala and I have been on the same side most of the time, on opposite sides sometimes, I can tell you no matter what side you're on, if you work with him, you will come to respect him because he is someone who understands how legislation is developed and how it can be passed or defeated. And that's critically important to all of us who care about the environment, about education, about healthcare, about the arts, many of the things that Senator Latvala has been involved with during his long legislative career. This has been his 15th legislative session. He is the Dean of the Florida Senate. And as a lawmaker, he understands the problems and the issues that confront people who are everyday folks who have to make a living. And the reason why is because he's actually one of the few legislators who signs the front side of a paycheck. He's an employer. He's a small business person. He understands what it's like to meet a payroll, to deal with health care requirements, to pay workers' comp premiums. He's one of the few legislators who is in that position, not employed by somebody, but someone who actually has to create jobs and make it possible for others to take home a paycheck on Friday. As a lawmaker, he also knows how to build coalitions. You can read in his biography that it's true, more than 200 major pieces of legislation bear Senator Latvala's sponsorship during his time in the Florida Senate. Issues as critical to our state's future as Florida Forever. That was Jack Latvala's bill. And if you care about beach restoration, which we do here in Northwest Florida, he made sure, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, that there's more money to protect our beaches than ever before in Florida history, and he did that in this session. A wide, absolutely, Jim, you can clap for that. The wide range of organizations who have named him Legislator of the Year stretch from environmental groups to law enforcement to healthcare to every part of the economy and culture of the state of Florida. He and his wife Connie have a stake in Northwest Florida. They're down the street, neighbors of ours at Seaside. He knows our area, he cares about our area. Many of the people who are here today have crossed paths with him and know how important Northwest Florida is to Senator Latvala. And that's a concern because he now is being discussed widely as a candidate for statewide office. And if he does run statewide, he will run an extraordinarily effective campaign because he is an extraordinarily effective public servant. In Florida politics, if you want something said, there are plenty of people who can do it. But if you want something done, it's our speaker today, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Jack Latvala.
Almost makes me wonder what you need in the budget next year, Don. Before I get going, we were introducing people in the audience, and I think we missed one very important person in the audience. And maybe they introduced you, and I didn't hear it. But I'm good to see my friend Mike Hill over here, who I served with for 3 or 4 years when he was in the House of Representatives, and who I'd love to see come back up there with us as soon as he can get there. But good to have him. Also good to have my colleagues and former colleagues in the Senate here. I think it's well known the special place in my heart that Greg Evers has. He's like my little brother in all facets. And he was a very loyal friend of mine while I was in the Senate. Very effective senator for this area, cared really deeply about the people he represented. And now Doug is up there to take his place, and certainly look forward to serving with Doug. We had the first year and we did real well, and look forward to that in the future. And it is not true that I served when John Broxson was in the Senate. I missed him by a couple of years, even though I've been there a long time. You know, I heard, when I heard that Senator Gates was going to introduce me, I prepared a lengthy rebuttal. So either way, kind of two different speeches, but one of them was a rebuttal. You know, one of the things that, you know, I'm a senator. Never been a House member, never wanted to be a House member, never been in any other branch of government. I'm a Florida state senator. I served in the 90s, from 1994 to 2002, and I loved being in the Florida Senate. And then, because of term limits, which I voted for along with most of the other Republicans in Florida, I had to leave in 2002. And I stayed out for 8 years. And, you know, heard the call to come back. Actually, the call to come back was the day the Florida House passed a proposed bill to allow offshore oil drilling 3 miles off our Gulf Coast, all the way up and down our beaches, and that was my call to come back to Tallahassee. So I came back to Tallahassee in 2010 and found a completely different place because of term limits. And because so many House members had moved to the Florida Senate, and the Florida Senate became a lot more like the Florida House in that a kind of a militaristic organization with the presiding officer running things. Well, that was until I came back. And I tried to throw as many stink bombs into that system as I could, because I was a pure Florida senator who was used to the way the Florida Senate, and I'm sure the way Senator Broxson served before, where we had 40 individuals elected by our communities, raised up by our communities. We went to Tallahassee and we did as we damn well thought was the best for the constituents we had. Not what anybody told us to do in Tallahassee, but what we thought was best for the people that we represented. So I came back and we had a couple of disastrous years. And just about the time I was ready to give up on the Florida Senate, the new Florida Senate, Don Gates became our president. And I've said this on numerous occasions, and I wouldn't, Don and I are a lot alike. We wouldn't say anything bad about the other one in a crowd otherwise, and that we wouldn't say to their face, and likewise good. And Don restored my faith a little bit in the Florida Senate. Stopped the tendency of the Florida Senate sucking the rear end of the Florida House. We stood up. We had a good 2 years where we got good policy done. He restored the traditions and professionalism in the Senate, and it was even though I was the ethics and elections chairman, which is the place that he put me that I could cause the least harm. He thought, even though that was my distinguished role for that 2 years, I still enjoyed the 2 years. I had 9 bills one year that had 4 committee references. Never will forget that. And he kept me very, very busy, but he was still a good president of the Senate. And I want to say that in front of all of you, because I know he represented you. You know, we had a session this year where we had kind of mixed results. I was just explaining to Don some of the internal aspects of what happened. But I think probably the biggest thing to explain what happened this year was, again, term limits. With term limits, you know, people, when we were voting on that back in 1992, some people proposed that term limits were going to be, were going to bring power to the lobbyists. Some people said term limits were going to bring power to the staff. What has really happened is term limits have brought power to the two presiding officers, to almost to the degree that they're the only two votes that count anymore. Certainly the case in the House, but in the Senate it's gotten more and more like that. And as a result of that, when we sit down and we have negotiations for the budget or for the allocations for the budget, which is the first step of getting to the conference, then the horse trading starts. And you have one presiding officer that's got a set of priorities. The other presiding officer has a set of priorities. They get together and they say, okay, I'll give you this for that. And this year probably got a little more carried away than it has been in recent years. We got back to a system that I thought went away in 2011 of doing conforming bills. And I'm as guilty as anyone because I thought I had a pretty good handle on that. It was in the budget process. That was in my area of responsibility. I never dreamed that we'd end up with an education bill that had parts of 21 other bills in it, including bills that had been beaten in the Senate. I never realized that we were going to have significant appropriations attached to those conforming bills, which this is the first time that's ever happened. And we got into a situation the last day of session where it could have been like 2011. The votes weren't there for some of those bills to pass. And what would have happened in that case was that the whole thing would have come tumbling down. We'd had to start all over from scratch. I made the decision to suck it up, take responsibility, go on the floor, and explain to folks what had happened, but in the process, I got the assurance of our presiding officer, Senator Negron, that would never happen again under his watch. So that means next year is going to be different. So I got that assurance from him, and then we went to the floor and we got the work done that day. The education bill, which I know many of you are unhappy about, should be unhappy about. I voted against many of the facets of that bill and individual bills along the way. I felt 95% positive the governor will veto. I still believe he will veto that bill. I have asked him to veto that bill. And then, you know, we start over with the House on the defensive because it'll be their priority that got beat. And so that's where we are today. I think that there's a possibility the governor will veto the whole budget. But I think more likely the governor will just veto, you know, the education, that education conforming bill, and perhaps the education formula in the budget, so that we can go back, take some of that money that we put in other things in the conforming bill and put it back in the education formula. I, as the appropriations chairman, operated within the constraints of the allocations that each subcommittee was agreed to by the two presiding officers. And I don't like the fact that after being there for 15 sessions, the year I become the appropriations chairman, we have 21 counties in Florida that their per student expenditure for education, for public education, actually went down. That's just not satisfactory to me. So I hope we get another go at it. If we get another go at it, I will assure you that I'm going to do my dead level best to get it right. State colleges, I noticed I was a little uncomfortable that you were within tomato throwing range over here, Dr. Meadows. State colleges took a temporary hit, I believe, Our president is a little more oriented toward the university side of the coin, and that was a tough situation. And but my commitment to the many of you, maybe you don't know it, but I ran against Senator Negron for president for 3.5 years. You remember that, Don?
Just vaguely.
You remember that, Greg? For 3.5 years, we had a race going on, and then we came up with the idea that we would split the difference, and he would be the president, and I would be the appropriations chairman. And the one commitment I made that he asked me for when we made that deal was that his priorities I would support him on. Well, there was 3 of them, and higher education and his priorities in higher education were one of the 3. I committed that I would support him, and I keep my word. And that doesn't mean you have to like it necessarily, but I did keep my word on that. But next year's a new year, and next year we'll see what happens. And I appreciate the patience that you've exhibited. All of your members haven't exhibited, but I begged them to, because presiding officers, as Don knows, it's a short period of time. It really goes by pretty quickly. And the institutions that are represented in our state continue on. And so different presiding officers have different priorities, but you're going to be there when the presiding officers that are there now aren't there. Now, shifting gears to economic development, which is the other reason that the governor may bring us back. And I know you've heard about this, and I know that Speaker Corcoran was here not long ago. He sent Frank White to represent him today. Frank, where are you? Okay, Frank's here to take any questions on behalf of the House today. Wonderful, wonderful, young, new, first-time House member. And it's not his fault, I will tell you. Everything bad the House did this year is not his fault. But I guess, I'm not sure when Speaker Corcoran was here, because I looked at Pitbull's concert schedule and I didn't see a date here. But he's, after getting mad at Visit Florida because of Pitbull, this week he's been hanging out with Pitbull and tweeting out pictures of he and Pitbull together. So I think there must be friends now, and I don't know whether that means he's friends with Visit Florida or not, but we did some damage this year to our economic development effort in Florida. It started out basically as the dismantling of our economic development program in Florida. Not just Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida, but 16 other economic efforts that have been in the statutes in Florida were all wrapped up into one bill to repeal all 18 of them. Not just cut their budget, repeal them. That's where we started with the House Speaker, Corcoran, this year, was getting rid of all of them. Now, fortunately, guys like Frank White and J.R. Williamson and other folks out here, and Clay Ingram, who didn't obviously have the nerve to come today, he's the one I know the best. They prevailed on the Speaker to kind of pull that back and change, kind of fall back and punt a little bit on that. So we ended up with just a cut in the expenditures. But it's a 2/3 cut in the advertising for Visit Florida. Now, for an industry that has 1.4 million people in Florida that depend on it for a living, a 2/3 cut in the advertising for that industry is, I think, unconscionable and unacceptable. And the governor, I think, agrees to that, so that may all come into play with what he decides to do. Granted, the people at Visit Florida that were running Visit Florida made a couple bad decisions. I'm not sure whether hiring Pitbull for $1 million is a bad decision. They have a pretty persuasive case of the change of the mix of tourists that are coming to Florida, to European and South American tourists who spend more money while they're here. I'm not sure whether that was a mistake or not, but I know they made some mistakes. But I think it's important when you have a situation like that, and in my business, when I have a situation where I have a person that makes a mistake or is not doing their job, we get rid of the person, not the business. So, you know, doing what we're doing with Enterprise Florida and with Visit Florida is, you know, is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think it's very short-sighted. You know, Pam Dana, I think, was around when we started Enterprise Florida, or came shortly thereafter with Governor Bush. Enterprise Florida used to be a state agency with state bureaucrats. They were in an office right behind the Senate office building called the Department of Commerce. And when Republicans took control of Tallahassee, we said, no, we'd rather have a public-private partnership between government and private business and bring more private business into the situation, into the partnership, into the activity. You know, kind of a novel concept. You know, get rid of state bureaucrats, turn it over to private business. Difference is, you know, private business does things a little differently than state government does. Yeah, their expense accounts might be a little bit bigger in private business. They don't have a $21 limit on dinners in private businesses and things like that. But once again, with Enterprise Florida, where other states are out every day recruiting businesses from Florida and from other states who we're competing with to come to their states and spending money, we are now naked. We are now on the field, unilaterally disarmed when it comes to economic development. The Navy Federal is the greatest, I really think probably one of Enterprise Florida's greatest examples. Those jobs within 10 or 15 miles of where we are right now would not be there without Enterprise Florida. And I've heard the people from Navy Federal say that. So that's what we're going to, that's what we're now going into, is a period of time where we don't have any tools for our economic recruiters. And I just think that's wrong. And I especially think it's wrong because on the count of, because Americans for Prosperity, a political group, says it's wrong, and so therefore we're making laws based on what Americans for Prosperity says. Or we're making laws based on what someone who wants to run for office says, to higher office. I just think it's wrong to do that. We need to make decisions and we need to make policy based on an evaluation of what's right and wrong. There's not been any study done on any of these issues with Enterprise Florida, Visit Florida. No Auditor General's report, no OPAGA study. We have mechanisms to do that. No, they just came up with the idea, getting rid of them, and we've been playing defense ever since. So I stand 100% foursquare with the governor on that issue, and I hope that we'll work it out. And there's another reason. It's not just the jobs. It's taxes, okay? Visit Florida alone has a return on investment of $3.20 for every $1 we invest in that advertising. So that's direct. That's $3.20 in tax revenue for every dollar we spend. We reduce our spending, we reduce the revenue, and that means that we reduce the revenue to the state, which we have to operate on, the revenue to local communities, which they have to operate on. Who's going to pay those additional taxes that tourists are paying now? We are. So there's another reason to think twice before we, before we make a precipitous decision like that. U.S. Travel, which is a travel group, estimates that without the tourism, that Florida residents would have to pay an additional $1,500 a year in taxes, state and local taxes that are currently paid. California, how did they respond to us cutting our spending on Visit Florida? They doubled their spending. And all of us that are in business know that when we quit advertising in our businesses, we start dying. And I don't want that to happen here in Florida on the whim of just one politician who will be gone from office in a couple of years. We have a lot of that in Tallahassee, and a lot of decisions made based on people running for higher office and so forth, and I think that's one of the things wrong with our system that we have there. Now, good news, we passed Triumph. You're going to have directly the money that was promised to this region, the 8 counties in this region, going to flow directly to the Triumph board with just minimal conditions. Going to have to be spread out. You're going to have to include the small counties to the east, maybe a little more than everyone planned on, but it's coming. It's done. That bill is signed. This year, you know, as Don said, we did some great things with beaches, you know, to spend more money on beaches, and I'm real proud of that. I think that will help with keeping tourists coming because that is a very important part of our economy. We cut taxes minimally. You're still going to have your tax holiday in September back to school. You're also going to have a disaster preparedness tax holiday like next week, assuming the governor signs that bill this week. But June 1st, right around the beginning of hurricane season, there will be a tax holiday. And, you know, we have now in our tax bill, we exempted feminine products from sales tax for anyone that might be applicable to. So I would consider that a win for some of you. We had a lot of fun with that. But you know, it's been my pleasure to be in the Florida Senate. As I said, 15 sessions now, adding it all up. Got one more next year. It's still, I think, the best job in government. It's a place where if you pay attention to what you're doing and work hard, you can get just virtually anything done. And I appreciate the opportunity to come out here with you today and look forward to serving you in the future. And if I can ever be of any help, please reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, so if you have a question for Senator Latvala, if you would please write that on the paper on your tables and pass that up to the front. And also, since we are very fortunate to have Senator Broxton with us today, sir, if you don't mind, would you be willing to speak for just a few minutes about the legislative session and your opinions on some of the issues mentioned?
Well, I think you just heard the vintage Jack Latvala. He's a unique person, and he does keep his word. I can tell you that when he tells you he'll do something, he'll do it. And when he made a decision with Senator Montford and Gaynor and I that he would help us get Triumph, he was a bulldog. And he went and spoke to the speaker and told him what our wishes were. And because of him and Senator Negron, Frank White, and all the people in the legislature, we were able to deliver what, and ironically, was our own money back to us. So for the next 15 years, we're going to see a tremendous impact to this area. $1.5 billion that we negotiated very carefully with BP, and it was because it was passed, I think, without one negative vote in the House and no negative votes in the Senate. So the people of Florida, the people that represent Florida, stood with us, realizing that what we got was really our money. And I want to thank you, Senator Gates, for setting the table with Triumph. Triumph's going to be a great vehicle to deliver that back to the Panhandle. Senator Latvala was a champion and has been a champion, and it is going to be a great benefit for us for the next 15 years. If we do it right, the pressure is back on us to make sure that we spend that that money properly, and we will. I'm certain we will, because you're going to make the board of directors, which will be expanded to 7 from Franklin County all the way over to Escambia, and we're going to make sure that that changes the environment in the Panhandle. We're so blessed. We're the only 8 counties that will have that kind of resources to build the ends of our economy around the military and tourism and the other businesses that come here. And we have to do that. And thank you, Senator, both senators. Senator Evers, you were a vital part of it, and I want you to know that we appreciate the fact that you kept encouraging us to push forward. And today, it's on the governor's desk. And did you say the governor had signed it?
No, I didn't say
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully the governor will sign it. He'll come over here and have a celebration to tell us what this will mean to the area, especially if we can do the kind of things that Senator Latvala wants to do and make sure that we properly fund Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida. So thank you for being here, and look forward to serving you.
If Governor Scott comes up this way, will you please ask him to address Tiger Bay? So also, I'd like to recognize somebody. I just was informed that former Representative Dave Merzen is in the audience. Welcome, sir. And now for our first question, I just want to ask, thank you. Sir, since you've been in the Senate for some time, your opinion right now, what are the best and worst outcomes you've seen from this session?
Well, I think the worst outcome was obviously in the education area, which I already addressed, and the process of how we arrived at that. I think that didn't make any of us look very good. And after 5 or 6 years in a row of not having that kind of thing in the process, it just reminds us of how bad things can be. With regard to the best, obviously for your area, I think the Triumph bill is the best. You know, I think also that the rest of the budget that we crafted was very well done, very inclusive. Tried to handle the priorities of all the different parts of the state. We accomplished, I think, something very significant in the Everglades with Lake Okeechobee, that will have benefits in the years ahead with regard to cleaning up the Everglades, cleaning up Florida Bay down in the Keys, and I think that was pretty much landmark legislation also.
I am not going to ask you if you're going to run for governor, because I know that there's some deliberation in that, but I was going to ask you this, is if you do seek the governorship, what would be your priority as governor?
Well, let me start with the question you didn't ask. You know, and I'm not really ready to fit. We got press here, and I'm not really ready to say, you know, if I am. But let me answer it this way: if I am, why am I doing it? And part of the reason for that is in what I've seen in the process since I've been back to the Senate since 2011, with too much of the process in Tallahassee, just like in Washington, being led by people who are career politicians. They start out as legislative aides, they become House members, then they become senators with very minimal experience in the real world. And the real world to me is making a payroll, paying workers' comp premiums. I mean, we couldn't get a workers' comp bill done this year, and part of that is because of the 40 members of the Senate, there's only 6 or 7 of us that actually have businesses where we employ people, where we have to pay workers' comp. So we've got a lot of lawyers, we've got a lot of people that have various no-show jobs, working for different people, and you thought you ended that, but you really didn't. They found ways to get around that. And so I think we need a business perspective. I think we need experience in the real world. And I just don't see that on my side of the aisle in the governor's race. For priorities, I'd say that my highest priority is not to have Florida be number 49 or number 50 in so many areas, okay? Right now, Florida is number 50 in spending per capita on mental health. And I think that's a real shame, because mental health includes substance abuse. We've got hundreds of people dying in an opioid crisis, to the extent that the governor declared a state of emergency on the opioid crisis last week or the week before. But we're number 50 on mental health. We're number 49 in spending per lane mile for our road system. Okay, now it hadn't shown up here yet, but in Miami and in Tampa and Orlando, it's darn sure showed up. We don't have big enough, wide enough roads for the people that we have on them. Our school system, I think we're 43rd in graduation rates, and somewhere in the 40s on spending per student. And nothing is free in this world. We have to prioritize our resources. We have to do things smart. And so I'm just tired of Florida being number 50, and that's what I want to work on.
We do have a question here. If you do not decide to run for governor, would you consider running for chief financial officer?
No.
Yeah, that was good. Very quick. So, okay, regarding Enterprise Florida, what % of public versus private funding is the total? Basically, I think they're looking for the public-private mix there.
Well, I think obviously if you look for the incentive dollars that have been paid out, it's like 100% state incentive dollars. If you look at operations, I think it got to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% public, 20% private. I think, and the point of that question is that it's not 50-50. I don't think we ever set it up to be 50-50. But I would say that 20% of the cost is better than 0% of the cost, which is what it was when it was a state agency.
What is the research basis for more money for education equals better education?
The research basis, I can't quote a survey, but I can tell you that when I go into a school that's Title I school and talk to them about, I had some money left over for my campaign, and I asked them, how they would like me, that I want to donate some money to the school. It's my neighborhood school, got a lot of Hispanic kids in there, and I wanted to help them with some of the money left over for my campaign. I said, what do you need? And they said, we need computers. We have like 8 computers for all the kids to use on all the testing that the state requires. And so, the resources are not there to do the things that we tell them that they need to do. When you go into a public school and, you see leaky roofs, when you see buildings in disrepair, then do I have a research study saying that affects the quality of what comes out of there? No. But I got 65 years of experience on this earth that tells me that will affect the quality. When you have a business, a public business, and you don't maintain that business, I have a car wash. I own a car wash. One of the things that keeps the car wash from being vandalized is by keeping it in good shape and clean and nice to start with. Because once you allow the vandalizing, once you don't fix it and clean it up, then that just, it blossoms. Same way. I mean, you know, it's the atmosphere of learning. So do I have a research study on it? No, but I got years of experience that tell me that.
Term limits or reaction to popular frustration with perceived abuses. Thinking of Washington, D.C., what is the relationship among term limits, and then it lists a few issues: voter fraud, a dubious claim, in parentheses, voter suppression, next credible claim, and gerrymandering, a clear problem.
Yeah, I can pretty much guess the party affiliation of the asker of that question. You know, you mentioned Washington, D.C. One of the problems with that term limits amendment to start with was when it was on the ballot, it was written, and you'll remember this, it was written to apply to both congressmen and state legislators. But then the courts threw out the Congress part and said that state constitution couldn't impact the qualifications of a federal officer. So it was sold that it was going to affect both, but in the end, it ended up only affecting us. You know, I generally think that the level of government closest to the people is the one they have the most confidence in. I polled that issue. Starting, you know, the confidence in Washington is like in single digits in some polls now. A little better when you get to Tallahassee. The biggest level of confidence that people still have is in their local government, local, county, and city government. And so with regard to all the litany of does it impact voter suppression, actually there was an article I just read this morning that the legislature didn't take action this year on a bill on joining the compact that actually checks to see if you're registered in more than one state. Now, if you call measures like that to prevent you from being registered in more than one state suppression, well then I support suppression. Because, I mean, that's just common sense. You shouldn't be able to vote in more than one state or more than one locale. But we didn't even do that. So I don't know how anybody could think we're having voter suppression. Redistricting was a rough situation. I'm going to let Senator Gates answer that question. We had one roll dust up on that one. You know, it was the people passed an amendment. You know, we do our best to implement it within the constraints of human nature. And there is nothing more personal in Tallahassee than your own district and what it looks like. And we had some really bad moments. Was it last year or the year before? The year before on that issue.
We're going to get to some specific pieces of legislation here shortly. So with that, I'll begin with the first one. My question is, should government to private utility providers be competing with our free markets? One more question, please. Should these monopoly utility providers be exempted from, looks like Senate Bill 489, Florida Building Code, and the Construction Industry Licensing Board incidental to their business? Those are in parentheses, and that is House Bill 1021.
Frank, do you know the answer to that? I'm sorry, I can't cite a specific bill and what the provisions were. Should they be exempt from building codes just because they're electric utility? No. I think the utilities have kind of had free reign in Florida for a long time, and I don't think that's right. This year we stopped an effort that wouldn't have affected this area immediately, but it would have affected half of the Floridians that are served by Florida Power and Light, and that is an effort which would, for the first time, have made ratepayers pay for exploration for the energy source that then you'd use for the power. specifically fracking in Oklahoma. The way the bill was actually filed and moved in the House actually would have included offshore oil drilling. When that came to committee in the Senate, the first stop, we raised some sand about it, and we put a lot of amendments on it. Still passed through that committee, but then the decision was made, and I guess I have to give Speaker Corcoran the credit for this. He made the decision not to move the bill any further in the House, so we quit moving it in the Senate too. Or that would have probably passed. I'd have voted against it. There'd have been half a dozen or 10 of us vote against it, but it would have still passed. And if you want to know the reason, just look up, just Google FP&L political contributions.
Could you elaborate on the potential effects to Florida residents if ACA is repealed or not repealed?
Well, ACA is the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which is the agency that supervises healthcare, hospitals, nursing homes, and so forth in Florida. I assume, okay, the ACA is the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare as it's known most widely. I don't think we have analyzed the impact of that yet. I know in my business, as someone who's always provided group insurance for my employees' health care, the result of the ACA has been like 40% increase in my premiums over the last couple of years. Can't imagine it get much worse than that. I think the potential is there for some sort of a block grant situation where the Medicaid funding will change over to block grants and give the state the flexibility of how we put it into effect, and that will have a good impact on us. But I don't think any of it. It depends on what it's replaced with. Repealing the ACA without replacing it with something is going to create a lot of issues, and so we have to see what is suggested, and then we analyze it from there.
The next governor will be able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. If you have that opportunity, what would you look for in an appointee?
Strict constructionists of the Constitution. We don't need judges who make law. We need judges who interpret the law, and I'm very firm on that.
Was changing the default of the Florida retirement system to an investment plan a good idea? Seems like a major gift to Wall Street. Will it make the pension plan unstable? The first responders still default to the pension plan?
Well, this, I mentioned to you trading, the horse trading that goes on. This is a good real live example of something I traded this year. I thought our state employees should have a pay raise. They hadn't had one in 11 years. And I thought they should have a pay raise. I thought our law enforcement officers and our corrections officers in our prisons should have even a bigger pay raise. So we put those in a bill. In return for the House accepting that, they asked us to accept a change in the Florida retirement system. And that change was to change the way the default mechanism works in the retirement system. Now, as my colleagues in the Senate know, and anybody that served in the House while I've been in the Senate know, there hadn't been a bigger defender of the Florida retirement system in the last 7 years in the Florida Senate than me. Because I think if you're not giving people a raise, the least you can do is make sure they got a decent pension. So this has been an issue of changing the default mechanism, which is basically how that works is when you're employed in state government or in an agency that's in the Florida retirement system, you get a choice. So whether you want to be in the traditional pension system, which is called the defined benefit plan, or in a 401k type plan, which is what I'm in, which is called the Florida investment or the investment plan. Right now, if you don't check a box, then you're defaulted into the defined benefit plan. You have 6 months to make that decision after you're employed. You also have the opportunity to make one change in your career to change from one plan to the other. We worked out, you know, a little bit. They proposed changing the default to defaulting into the investment plan if you didn't make the selection. We ended up agreeing to giving them 9 months instead of 6 to make the change, and we exempted out first responders, which is basically police and fire, from that. You know, we still had, and to me, I think that's fair. You know, we're giving everybody the same opportunity to be in whichever plan they want to be in, and if they don't check a box, it's not my fault, okay? The unions who care so much about protecting this default, they have the ability to go to their members or the groups they represent and teach them that. They got 9 months to do it. But still, we had several unions came to the committee meeting when we presented that. And you know, I don't do it very often, but I sort of lost my cool.
Oh, shocker.
And the lobbyist for the university professors was up there, okay, complaining about, you know, the default and their members not understanding that they had to make a choice in 9 months. And my words were something to the effect of, if your members who are teaching our kids in college are too damn dumb to know that, then I don't want them teaching our kids in college. And I might have left out the damn. But, you know, it was much ado about nothing. Now, in that, we also got the ability to re-enroll in FRS, which is something that got taken away from people based on people who were elected officials, then they ran for office, or then they took other jobs and they padded their pensions, and they tried to fix that back in 2010, I think it was. We call it the Fasano Amendment. And we changed that so that you can re-enroll, because it was impacting a lot of young people who would maybe go to work for state government for a couple of years, they'd be in the pension plan, then they would leave not knowing any better, and then they would want to come back and they couldn't come back. So we made a change to allow them to come back. So all in all, I mean, I think it was a pretty good trade-off. And we got people who hadn't had a raise in 11 years a raise.
Just one quick question. If someone were to ask you as a candidate for statewide office, what drives your political thinking? What is the thing that drives how you frame your political thought?
So what's the right thing to do? I've always had a good internal compass of between right and wrong, and so I ask myself, what's the right thing to do? And you know, it's not always the most conservative thing to do. I think you've got to be able to make those battlefield calls. You can't read it in a book. You can't have a philosophy that's based on something you read. It's got to be learned. It's got to be experienced. And then you go out and you do what's the right thing to do at that given moment.
In closing, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to recognize a few people. Once again, I want to thank Apollo Water Technologies for being our newest corporate member. President Gates. Sorry, definitely.
No, that's not me.
President Gates, I want to welcome you to our club and thank you for the introduction you provided. It was really well done, sir. And so welcome. Senator Broxton, thanks again for joining us. Senator Evers, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, our guests, education community especially, President Saunders, President Meadows, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, you saw something here today that I think you're probably not going to find in many other places. You see people who disagree, people who probably have some history with each other, actually get together, discuss, consider issues. And so this is where leadership happens. So if you're not a member, consider becoming a member. And please bring your friends here. Like I said before, and I'm very grateful that we had Senator Broxton with us today. We needed a Tiger Bay 40 years ago. This country and this community need things like Tiger Bay more today than ever before. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and close the meeting. Next month, we have Dr. Rodney Gutman from the University of West Florida. And then in July, we have Captain Keith Hoskins from Gulf Power. Thank you so much.
Well done, Jack.